Thank you so much for joining us today for Sigma 360's panel discussion on adverse media and geopolitics. We're really excited today to explore how geopolitical instability is reshaping financial crime risk and what compliance teams need to be doing differently to stay ahead of this. So I'm Bernice, I lead product marketing here at Sigma 360, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. So before we begin, I want to let you know that we will be recording today's session. So throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we're going to address as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So firstly, we have Stuart Jones, our founder and CEO here at Sigma 360.
Good morning.
Stuart is a former U.S. Treasury Department and National Counterterrorism Center official, and he led regional efforts to combat illicit finance. So here at Sigma 360, he has built an AI-powered platform helping institutions identify and act on financial crime risk. And then joining him, we have our guest speaker here, John Walsh. He is founder of SightSpan, and he is a 40-year AML veteran. In addition, John is also a strategic advisor to multiple fintechs and bank boards, including Trans-Pecos Banks here in San Antonio, Texas. John has advised governments across 70-plus countries, and also earlier in his career, he built Bank of America's AML programs as well. Not only this, but he's also an active user of Sigma 360. So his perspective today is really grounded in what the work actually looks like in the field. So with that, let's get started. Just to start us off with, John, you've advised officials in over 70 countries, as I said, on AML and financial crime risk. And you've told me before that geopolitics is always financial. To set the scene, can you briefly cover why it's important to pay attention to geopolitical instability in the first place? And also, how is adverse media a key driver in fighting financial crime?
Thank you, Bernice, and thank you everybody for joining, and thank you Sigma 360 for inviting me. Stuart and I have known each other for many, many years, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak with him and to you. When we look at AML and counterterrorism and illicit activity overall, we often think about computers. We often think about how to get things faster. We think about the internet and doing searches. But one of the things, like when I started in this business, there was no internet, there was no computers that we know of today, and a lot of it was manual. So you really needed to look at geopolitical situations, look at regional situations at a much deeper level than is currently discussed today. In my opinion, it's actually more important than ever, not less important. But we do have availability now to a lot of information that we didn't have when I started in this field. So when you look at geopolitical situations, wars, regional conflicts, internal strife, if you look at all of these countries that are currently engaged in some type of combative activity, there's over 21 countries in the world right now involved in combat activity, not counting civil wars and others. So there's quite a bit going on. There's always one or two that we talk about in the newspapers and at cocktail parties, but there's a lot going on around the world. And what we need to do in this profession is always be one step ahead of everybody as much as possible, if not two steps ahead. So we see a regime change, if you see border changes, as we saw in Crimea, and then we saw in other areas of the world in South Sudan and other areas outside of Rwanda. As borders change and regimes change, the sanctions list change, how we deal with people change. If you look at the changes recently in Syria, they're almost mind-boggling. It's hard to comprehend the amount of change in Syria in the last 10 years. But we as professionals need to not just look at zeros and ones. We need to look at people, we need to look at countries, and we need to look at regional activity. When you look at negative news or adverse media, it's really, really important to be looking at elections, who's coming into power, who's not coming into power, because your program at your bank or your organization, or depending on where you sell to and who you deal with, is going to change based on the outcome of those elections, based on the outcome of that combative situation. And we have to be ready for that. Whether we like it or not, Borders change, regimes change, people change. And we need to be looking at media and adverse media or any news about somebody. We say adverse media. That's a little bit unclear to me at times because what's adverse to one person is positive to another person. So we need to look at relevant media, and what is relevant to our organization on a regular basis.
Awesome. That's a really important framing to have, especially the context of relevancy and making sure that you're looking at what happens and what matters to you. So let's really get into the definition here of adverse media then. When we talk about adverse media, what does that actually mean in a geopolitical context? So, for example, are we talking about like news articles, court records, or leaked documents, etc.? What would be in the scope of adverse media? And this
Well,
question is open to the floor.
I'll just jump in there. I think John, good to see you. Good morning. I think John, hit the nail on the head. I think it's about change, and how can you, from a program perspective and an institutional perspective, understand that change, and really to do that, to John's point, given the quantum of data that's out there, I think you have to go beyond what would traditionally be adverse media or negative news screening. I think, John will remember, it started with reading newspapers. A lot of people had teams that would come in and read a newspaper. They'd have several subscriptions to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They'd come in and read and make sure there was nothing in there about their client. And then it moved to doing a Google search, and then technology got a little more sophisticated, and firms started to come out with keyword searches, but you would run into issues there like maybe your client's name John Walsh, but maybe the publisher of an article or the author of an article is named John Walsh, and so you're matching on something that you don't really care about. Now the technology's gotten a lot better. With better technology, it means that we can pre-process data at scale, and we can move beyond traditional reporting lines that give us the quote unquote news. We can start to consider things like ICIJ and OCCRP. We can start to consider content that's unstructured, that's written in foreign language. We can move even beyond that and start to think about what else is out there from an unstructured data perspective that might give us meaning or signal around our customers from a risk perspective, so we know them. That's sort of the idea of know your customer. And when you get into that, you start thinking about court records and unsealed federal court indictments and things like this that are out there and freely available to get and process and bring into a pipeline of data that can be converted into information. And so from my perspective, I think about adverse media and negative news as, what is out there that is easily knowable, either using something that you have built in-house or using something that you're leveraging that a vendor can bring to the table. But if it's out there and it's knowable, then it's one of these catch-22s where, you didn't see it. A regulator comes in and sort of looks at this and says, well, it's right there. I mean, if you had just searched that name, in any commercially available search engine, you would have found it. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. But when we think about moving from technical compliance to effectiveness, and I'll die on this hill, the industry, and I think everyone that's on this call and that's in it really wants to be a part of a program that is effective. If we're trying to be effective, then we can't stop at local news and national news. We have to look in these other places where there is reporting that may be credible regarding our clients and our clients or our clients' counterparties that may be engaged in criminal activity.
That makes sense. And so I guess from Stuart, what you're saying, we're drawing from a much wider universe of sources than most people realize. And it's really important for everyone here in the audience to know this today. And this is where I want to bring you again, Stuart, because adverse media at the individual level is one thing, but as we know in our work in SIGMA 360 and also just your work in the field in general, we should also apply it to networks. So can you explain what network risk in terms of adverse media would look like?
Yeah, I think when we think about network risk and unstructured data and media, it's very simply this: the way that adverse media and negative news has been designed to work typically is I enter a name or I have a name that I bump against some sort of a pre-processed list of news and information, um, a name of a person, a name of a company, a name of a vessel. Um, the problem with that, and that's a really good place to start. But the problem with that is that you're not really comprehensively understanding who and what is around that name or that individual, and that might be something that is a bridge too far across an entire program. But when we're dealing with higher risk jurisdictions, we're dealing with higher risk products or client types. Considering this more holistically is something that we're seeing a lot of value in right now across industry. And an example would be maybe I run a Hong Kong energy company against negative news, and there really isn't any negative news, and there might not be any news at all about this entity, which could be a signal in and of itself. But when we start to look at who and what is connected to this Hong Kong energy company, who are the people involved in it, who are the companies and people associated with it that are written about in the news, that don't show up in corporate registry databases, that don't show up on sanction lists, that's where we start to figure out more from an effectiveness perspective what's actually happening, right? We see even examples of companies, primarily in Asia, being named in joint venture releases from North Korean companies. That's not necessarily a reason alone to not do business with someone, but it's certainly something I would want to know if a client of mine or someone that is the customer of my customer is involved in a JV with a North Korean company, especially one that's on a sanction list, is in the public domain writing about that sort of thing. That's something I would want to know about. That's what we're talking about when we think about network risk. One other quick thing on network risk to think about, one of the hottest topics, and we'll get onto this in a minute, but one of the hottest topics in financial crime compliance right now in the United States is Mexican drug cartels and drug cartels in general. When we look at those, they're different than what a lot of us sort of came up thinking about when we thought about AML and financial crime risk. When you think about Al Qaeda or you think about Hezbollah and terrorist organizations, like they're trying to hide, they're trying to cover their tracks. When we look at cartel activity, they're a little more open. CNN ran a interesting article about a month ago, "The Real Wives of the Cartel Bosses," and this sort of information is out there: who people are associated with, who their children are, the companies that they're engaged with. So I think for certain risk types in particular, terrorism's a little harder. But when we're thinking about narcotics and we're thinking about weapons trafficking and we're thinking about some sanction evasion activity in Russia, for example, that kind of information finds its way into easily obtainable news sources, and you can start to create link analysis around that is very powerful to understanding who you're working with and who you're working with is working with in a way that you just can't do alone using sanction lists or corporate registry data.
Definitely, that's a really interesting piece. The wives of cartel bosses. I think everyone should really be paying attention to that as well, just making sure that they're tracing your customer and then also the customers of your customer, etc. Just to make sure that you know the relationships of everyone you're working with. And I agree, Stuart, these are all super interesting examples of network risks that we should be paying attention to. So now on
Well,
to the main. Mhm.
if I could just add, Bernice,
Yeah,
and
of
John
course.
may have a thought on this too, but in my experience, and John has a lot of experience on the banking side, and he's seen more cases than anyone I know. But on the government side, it was very, very rare, if ever, that we saw anything major from a criminal perspective happening on an individual basis. It was not a single company. It was not a single person. It was a network. Criminals operate at scale using networks, using companies, using multiple people to do the bidding on their behalf. They are interwoven into the normal fabric of business in agriculture, in retail, and hospitality. So it's not as obvious to the eye as you might think. And I think the fact that we know the typology is network means that we have to be using corporate registry data and unstructured data like media in direct ways to make sure our customer directly doesn't have the risk that would cause an issue, but to be thinking more and more along the lines of effectiveness, meaning we need to be pointing our systems and pointing our data to looking for networks, and that's more possible now than ever.
I just want to follow up on that, Bernice. Stuart, you said so many things, right? That we could actually have a webcast on each. But the networks is critical, and I think you were present when I spoke to the Senate about the convergence of criminal organizations and terrorist organizations. If you went back 20 years, criminal organizations didn't want anything to do with terrorist organizations for branding reasons, for multiple reasons, right? The same as like if you went back to the 50s, some organizations didn't want to deal in drugs, some did. But like you saw this convergence of terrorist activity and organized crime around the world over the last 15 years, and the drug cartels were included in that. If you went back to years ago, maybe 10 years ago, when Hamas and Hezbollah were training down in Venezuela in exchange for drugs, and they all started to work together because it became so common that a one-time terrorist activity would use criminal organizations to do the terrorist act. And then they did so much that they became more and more partners. But the network side is, I just want to spend a moment on that and the criticality of this. There was a point in time when KYC was AML. Everything was KYC and SIP and know your customer. And then it transferred over to everything became transaction monitoring. And that was the thing of the day. And then it went back and forth where it's all important. Like, unfortunately, it's all equally important. And I don't like having multiple number one things, but like KYC and transaction monitoring are both equally important, because we generated so many alerts with the transaction monitoring that was like kind of like we can't manage this as a society or as an organization. So you had to go back and say, who is this person, so that you could set your parameters right. And
That's
now
right.
Technology is getting so good, you could set your parameters not only by tribes, but by down to the individual level. It's possible. And when you get into quantum AI, that's going to be more and more likely in the next decade. However, like one thing on the networks, and I just want to go back to that because I actually used the Sigma 360 in a real life example in the Middle East. There was a terrorist attack in Israel, and we were using Sigma 360 to find some people. And through that, we found a network. We actually found, and Stuart mentioned tail numbers of planes. Through the network, we found 4 747s parked in another country, and they were parked there for years. It's very expensive to maintain and park 747s, let alone buy them, maintain them, and hide them. But they were waiting there to be used at a later date. But as the longer you wait,
Wow.
the more the tail number goes down lower and lower. The same thing as like Google News. If you're very active, it's high. Less and less active, it drops down. So the networks are critically important. Another real life example I want to talk about with the network, and I think, well, Stuart was before Sigma 360, Stuart was in Afghanistan. I was all around. I don't know if Stuart was there or not, but I was doing an investigation in Afghanistan before I went to Bank of America. And it was interesting when the Haqqani network went from just producing and growing poppies and heroin, then they got into the transportation business. That kind of
Yeah.
changed things. Then they got into the production business. And the way we were able to find a lot of really bad terrorists, really, these are really, really bad people, was through chemical purchases from Chinese companies. So the network kept growing until there was exposure. So then all you had to do was go to the warehouse. They were buying chemicals from China to convert the poppies to heroin. So whoever went to pick up those chemicals, we knew was not on the up and up. So like again, these networks, from an intellectual standpoint, these networks are fascinating. They're like gigantic jigsaw puzzles because you are looking for a needle in a haystack. And you're not looking, as Stuart rightly pointed out, you're not looking for an individual in most situations. You're looking for groups of individuals. Another real life example, and then I'll pause. You know, we were recently using Sigma 360, and SightSpan does a lot of beneficial owners, and we were doing due diligence on a corporation, and it was very clear that there was another owner of that corporation. Like it's not on the corporate papers, but when you looked at mailing, you looked at other media, other information that's on Google, but there was other network information that we received from Sigma 360 that made us believe that there was another owner of the company. And after we had multiple conversations with other board members, we made a decision that, you know, that wasn't the case in this particular organization. Multiple times we've had to close accounts or deal with File SR and others because that network was there. But in that case, it turned out positive. But you know, people are afraid to deal with things, but like a lot of things that we do in this industry and a lot of things that Stuart and I did in our past lives actually help people. Like in
That's
other
right.
words, we help more people than we hurt. We're trying to find illicit actors, but we also want to protect society. We also want to protect good people. And I think AML and when you get into adverse media and other thing, everybody's like, well, we got to find the bad guys. Well, part of our job is rewarding good behavior. You know, and Stuart said something earlier about names. Like there was John Walsh from America's Most Wanted. Every time I call, even today, when I want to make a hotel reservation, I'm like, you John Walsh? And I'm like, no, that's another John Walsh. But like, we have to be careful. So like, I look at relevant information and discernment. So some of you might remember my LinkedIn photo was John Walsh from America's Most Wanted and myself giving speeches. We went around the country giving speeches, Walsh and Walsh. It's kind of funny, but that naming conventions are very interesting. That's for another dialogue. But we what part of our job is to help good people. That's my main point.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think, you know, uh, back to the effectiveness, you know, part of this, at a recent conference, someone asked, you know, how can we convince the leadership in our institution to invest in some of this stuff? This all sounds great. Like, how can we do it? And I think it's two things. It's one, you know, how can we protect people? How can we protect society from fraudsters, which are rampant right now? How can we protect our institution from sending or receiving money to you know, someone that's on one of these lists? You know, how can we get in front of a network like John's talking about? It's helping prevent the downside risk to the institution. But the other side of the coin is if we have these kinds of tools, if we're able to absorb using technology all of the data that's out there that could possibly be looked at instantly, and know whether or not who we're trying to work with or who our client is trying to work with is within risk appetite or not, then we can actually use this technology and use compliance for more business and getting into more business and opening more channels. At the end of the day, the vast majority, 99.999%, I'll always say, of transactions that people are trying to do around the world are for good things. They're trying to send money to their loved ones. They're trying to buy blue jeans or bananas or whatever. So if we have better technology and better data underpinning how our business is planning to grow, and believe me, you know, the CEOs and the board of all the financial institutions that folks on this call work for want to grow their business. This can be an enabler for growing your business responsibly, not just protecting on downside risk.
That's critical, Stuart. And actually, I still say dungarees. You said blue jeans. I haven't heard that in a while. But people make fun of me for dungarees.
You'll never hear me say dungarees, so this is the
Yeah,
one
yeah.
time.
Yeah. Well, in the country, we did that. But I think one of the things that we need to understand is when you have a good program in place, you can do more business.
That's
And
right.
again, I go to a lot of conferences where everybody's bad. And some of the work I did years and years ago when I was looking for Al Qaeda was like working with my counterparts in the government and looking at, this behavior is not unusual. Like weekend was Thursday and Friday. There was a lot of Islamic, I mean, there's a lot of bankers, so there was a lot of rules and regulations around that. And I was like, hey guys, this is like normal for somebody here. So a lot of our jobs and a lot of things Stuart has done in his career and mine, like it's really to help people. And our job now is to help people grow. We all want to find, I think everybody on this webcast and everybody attending wants to find illicit actors. We all have a passion for that. I do.
Yes.
I know Stuart does. And we've proved it by putting our lives on the line. But the thing is, we all have that passion, but we also have to have entrepreneurship where it's kind of like if you build out a good program, you could do more business.
That's
So
right.
to go to Trans-Pecos Bank, like we're in San Antonio, Texas, we're on the border, it's kind of like, well, you know what, there's some Mexicans live there. Like it's kind of like they're not all drug cartels. It's, so we have to be careful of stereotyping and tribalism. Same thing happened when I was working in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. And like we all know there's good and bad people. I don't want to get into that whole dialogue. However, it shifts and it turns. There was a lot of that, like when I started my career, that most of the names on the sanctions list or the OFAC list were Latin, then they became Arabic, now it's going Latin. There's actually political trends there. And that's where back to the geopolitical and why that's so important. We need to be looking at that and those trends. But there's lots of people I know somebody owns a bank from Mexico and like they came with nothing and now they own a bank. So it's kind of like, so, like we have to keep an open mind. We have to look at these things very pragmatically. But I can say when you use good tools like Sigma 360 or other good tools, and you have a good program, and your CEO on board says, why are we not growing? That's something that you have to deal from a business perspective. I think if you have a good program, you could do cross-border. If you have a good program, you can bank MSBs. The question is, do you have controls in place to deal with residual risk? Do you have controls in place to deal with ongoing risk? And one thing with media, I've seen a lot of, and SightSpan does a lot of audits, and Andrea Colbine does, a lot of audits, and she's really amazing in looking at finding and uncovering weak programs. The reality of it is you can't do a media search one time. And a lot of people do it once and they open the account 2 years later, that they're not knowing what's going on in the organization. It has to be ongoing. And it has to be sometimes 24 hours a day, depending on the risk factors. But you could open up an MSB or a higher risk organization. I don't mean MSB is a higher risk, but any organization you could open up. You just have to watch them more carefully and be able to defend your position. The key factor is to be able to defend why you're doing business with these people, not shut their account down.
Yep.
Definitely.
I agree with all that.
Agree with both of you that a good program is really core to financial crime compliance. And as you said, Stuart, everything should go hand in hand, like KYC, due diligence, adverse media, and the technology that we have today can really help us with that process. And appreciate you, John, for sharing your experience with Sigma 360. It really adds color to understanding network risk and how bad actors evade detection in many different ways. And we really need to be prepared against that in today's world. So, actually, I wanted to pull you in again, John, because you've shared a statistic with me once that I think every compliance officer in the audience should be aware of, and I'd really love to dig into it now. So, you said that adverse media signals sometimes surface around 2 years before a formal designation, say by
Mhm.
OFAC on a sanctions list. And from your experience, what kinds of signals tend to appear first, and maybe what should people be paying attention to?
That's a good point. And I was just looking at the clock. It's amazing. Stuart and I go out to dinner. It's like the last 4 hours when it's supposed to be 30 minutes. So we can do this all day. I think when you have a lot of passion about the subject, this happens. But Bernice, you're 100% correct there. What people, I always find it surprising when somebody gets named to the OFAC list or any sanctions list, even the EU list or the UN list. People are like, oh, this is amazing. No, it's usually not. there's negative news, and not just there's negative news about people on average 2 years prior to them getting on the OFAC list or the EU list or the UN list. The 2 years is for the OFAC specifically, but the other is it's relevant, it's close. It's not far off. And I think this is why it's so important to be looking at networks, to be looking at people, because very seldom do you see one individual going on OFAC without their associates or their family members or other. So it's kind of like, so that network becomes even more important, because it's not like it's kind of like, there's old expression, if you see a turtle on a fence post, he didn't get there by himself. So it's kind of like, well, you know what, if somebody gets on the OFAC list, it's not him or her. It's actually a network of people, and that's how you get government exposure at a global level. So it's really important to be looking at negative news, the network, and then negative news related to the entire network. Because what will happen is, if you look at organized crime or a terrorist organization, one person will get arrested, one person will have negative news on because of an event, and that will trigger other activities, whether it be murder, whether it be moving, whether it be closing accounts, opening up other accounts. But it always generates more information. So if you look at that with organized crime in the United States, if you go back and do any studies, you'll see that if somebody was executed or somebody was arrested, you would see the rest of the network adapt to that situation. Al-Qaeda did the same thing. Hamas does the same thing. Hezbollah does the same thing. So, I mean, this is not unusual. So that's why networking and negative news go hand in hand, but also using common sense and basically what our grandmothers taught all of us, like, if it doesn't feel right, doesn't look right, it's probably not right.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And Stuart, I would love you to weigh in a little bit here as well. As you mentioned, technology has made adverse media screening more scalable than ever, and it really has been something that helps us detect all of these risks. So how has that changed what's possible for compliance teams today, and how would that be able to help us?
I think, well, first of all, I love the stat about the 2 years in adverse media before the sanction list. And John said that's on average. So that means some of them are on for more than 2 years out in adverse media and investigative journalism reporting, in court records. I think this highlights the importance of this whole discipline of adverse media that we've been talking about. I think everyone on this call, if you're on this call, first of all, thank you for joining us. Second of all, you're interested in adverse media and probably believe that it is a useful control. We're seeing in Europe, for example, I was just in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and AMLA is coming in Europe, and there is a requirement to do adverse media screening. Most firms aren't ready for it. They're trying to get up to speed and get themselves in a position where they can actually do what the regulator is going to ask them to do. They're being asked to do this for a reason, because it is an effective control. I know it's an effective control. I think the statistics point out that it's an effective control. If there are individuals getting sanctioned, and it's not easy to sanction someone, by the way. You have to get a pretty good evidentiary package together to sanction someone in the first place. So there's value, in adverse media, especially if we're seeing people in adverse media end up being sanctioned. And so that control is powerful and it's useful. The problem is, in what we hear at conferences, what we hear from clients, what we hear just in general in the industry, is that the promise of technology to sort through all of this data and get down to a very important thing John said earlier in the call, what is relevant, has been really hard to do. There have been a lot of promises about how we can sort through all of this data to get to what's relevant to you, to your risk policies, to your program in particular. And what it has done is it's turned people off to adverse media, not because they don't want to do it, not because they don't believe that it's useful. It's just too noisy. It created too much work. It created too many false positives. I think for the first time, the tide is starting to change where we can consider not only normal news, but also the investigative journalism, and the court records and just other reporting in foreign languages, that's out there, and get really good and really scientific about how we marry the kind of news that your program calls for, by thinking about it kind of in two ways. One, is this news article about my client or not? And that's something you can put a probability on. How likely is this news article about my client, company, vessel, aircraft, individual, based on context clues in the article, where the article was published, how long ago it was published. There are lots of ways to get really dialed in on, is this article about my client, first of all. Second, back to the relevancy part, how material is this? Are we talking about someone releasing balloons on the beach in Florida and violating an environmental code, or are we talking about fraud or murder or sanction evasion? These are very different topics. These some may cause you to de-risk, some may cause you to reconsider a relationship. Some are maybe nice to know, but definitely wouldn't change the relationship you have with a client. Today, the technology is there to do that. And with that new technology, a lot of risk officers, a lot of compliance teams are starting to reevaluate how they want to apply adverse media. Historically, it's been done at onboarding. It's been done on higher risk client types on an ongoing basis. But as John mentioned, the real way to do adverse media, if you can do it and not overwhelm your team with false positives, is to do it more at scale. There are a lot of medium risk customers that end up becoming high risk customers and get missed in this cycle, that can now be covered more dynamically with the data and the technology that's available. So that's where it has gotten to. That's where I think proactive risk managers want it to be. It's just that the technology and the data availability wasn't there the way that it is now, even 2 years ago.
Mhm. Stuart, you mentioned a couple of points I just want to follow up on. One, Europe and making a mandate to use adverse media is a huge advancement again.
Yeah.
What I find, and we've spoken to this, and I've spoken to a couple of people on the Financial Services Committee and also the Banking Committee at the Senate, where Europe is getting ahead again in a sense where Europe really did a good job of insider threat, and then the United States followed. They also did a very good job of data protection. Now they're getting ahead of adverse media. I think it's a great move on the European community to make this a mandate. I think we're going to follow. I'm sure we're going to follow because we have it self-imposed by the regulators now, and good AML officers are doing this naturally. But as it becomes a mandate, you're going to see a lot more activity, a lot more attention here. That's important. That's the news. It's going
That's
to
right.
be more important. So I think also the relevant information is critical, and it's not just the newspapers. I was investigating a guy one time, and I remember speaking with him, and he says, "Oh, I've never been in this country. I'm not from there." And readily available information showed that he voted for the mayor of a particular city, and he voted in the presidential election in that country. So, but
Wow.
he's saying that he was never there. So, I mean, this was real time, right? But it was
Yeah.
readily available information. Actually, still is a good friend of ours found that for us. But that's there, and it's really important. The other piece, just to follow up what Stuart said, the importance of having some sort of policy or guardrails. We can't have biases. We all have biases. We can't have prejudice. So, like, in other words, it's kind of like I used to get calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. This is going back maybe 10 years ago. I would get calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. The CEO of this company was arrested for drunk driving. Should we close his account? Well, that wasn't a financial crime. He was arrested. He wasn't convicted. Let's all go back to sleep. We'll deal with this tomorrow. So, you can't be overzealous either. But as news becomes more readily available globally, like you're not dealing with 1, 3, 9 newspapers. You're dealing with with thousands and thousands, and this now internet news organizations, podcasts, you're talking about millions, if not a Google of information coming in. So I think we have to have some sort of guardrails to be teaching our examiners, our regulators, and also our staff, say, hey, this is relevant, this is not relevant, some sort of guidelines. And that's how you'll, systematically, you'll get rid of a lot of noise that way. But we also have to remember that human beings are making the final decision. We need to educate them. We need to partner with our teams and each other. Again, this is a universal language, and we're all trying to help each other find bad guys and bad women. So it's kind of like we have to work together on the adverse media side and the negative side. And I think where I really feel strongly about this webcast, I've been to a lot of conferences. They talk about it and they talk about it, but they don't follow through. They do it one time and they write up these great things, it goes into a client folder, and it's never touched again. News is a 24-hour a day thing, and I think we've learned that over the last decade. But like you have to be watching all the time, because bad people, and they know when to be quiet, and they know before they do something they usually get really quiet. So we have to be looking at this ongoing thing, and I think Europe is making some good advancements here. I think it's going to affect the United States marketplace and the email community globally.
Definitely. Thank you so much, John and Stuart, for sharing your insights. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for our speaker discussion, but appreciate you sharing why understanding global news is very important, and also having a robust adverse media program is the first step as well. So we've had some great questions come in from the audience, so we can dive into maybe one or two of them now. Firstly, we have a question that says, looking ahead, what's one emerging threat or trend in financial crime and geopolitical risk that you think the industry is underestimating right now? And this is open to the floor. John, Stuart, whoever wants to weigh in.
John, do you want to take that one first, or do you want me to?
Well, I'll start off and then pass it off, because you have a lot of experience here too. But I mean, we have some major developments going on in the last 6 months. So we have major developments in Lebanon, Israel, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Iran. We have a geopolitical climate that's changing so rapidly. I've never seen it happen before. Whether you agree or disagree or anything, it's happening. It's changing so rapidly that somebody you're doing business with, you're not going to be able to do business with. And you're going to get a phone call one day, and it's going to be those 22 clients that you can't do business with them ever again. And then you have to do the network and everything else. So you have to be looking at the global geopolitics and your portfolio of clients. And you have to be looking at, and you have to do these risk factors, I think, on a regular basis, monthly at minimum, where it's kind of like you need to be reporting to your board and your CO saying, hey, we have X number of clients in these regions. We have conflict in these regions. We have a high geopolitical risk in these regions, and be analyzing your risk to change. So it's the risk of change. So sometimes change is bad, sometimes change is good, but we do know things are going to change. And you have to look at your portfolio of investments, clients, and staff, and technologies and everything. I remember, when I ran e-commerce strategy at Merrill Lynch after 9/11, the data center was actually, one data center was 3 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The other was 6 blocks south. So they were both out. Then they moved everything to India. Then India and Pakistan were going to go to war, and we had to move it from India. So, so these things, these geopolitical things need to be thought out at a much higher level than ever before, because we have to ask ourselves a question that we never thought imaginable in our parents' and grandparents' age. So it's really, really important to be looking at geopolitical events and your clientele and your staff and your data. Those are all critical risk factors. And we need to do it on a regular basis. I can't stress that. It has to be done on a regular basis, because things change rapidly. Your enemy yesterday could be your best friend tomorrow.
That's so true, John. And, I would just add to what you're saying. I like what I'm hearing out of Treasury these days, U.S. Treasury here. I'm former Treasury. I stay in touch with Treasury. The feeling, what I'm hearing more and more, is back to this, technical compliance versus effectiveness. And, there's a real desire to help industry be effective. I think, look, you have to follow the rules, you have to do KYC, you have to do screening, you have to have a program, right? But what I'm hearing, from the government more and more is we want to help industry be effective. That's the whole point of this, is to be effective, to see things that you can report through SARS to law enforcement to make a difference. And you sort of with that in mind, I think when we talk about risks where industry can be effective and where maybe industry is not as leaned in as I would have expected, is on the cartel issue. Last year, the president named these drug cartels terrorist organizations, which changes materially the risk to a financial institution or a corporate that provides material support. Cartels operate in every state in America, right? This is not like Al Qaeda or Hezbollah or anything like that. These cartels are interwoven into the fabric and into the economy of the United States. They are using our banks. They are using payment processors. They are using remittance companies. They are here, and there are very severe penalties associated with providing material support. And so, that is a risk that I think is very real. Fentanyl is the leading killer of Americans between 18 and 45. I think, thank God, it is starting to drop some, but it is still very dangerous. A lot of times these cartels are printing, pills that people think are Adderall or something else. They don't think that they're buying fentanyl, and children are dying in communities across America. And this doesn't need to be a political issue. This is an American issue, and this has reached a national security level at this point for our country. And so when we think about being financial crime fighters, this is something that we need to be on the lookout for. This is something we the royal we are on the front line around. And I mentioned this a couple of times during my commentary. Adverse media is a very effective tool. It is not the only tool, but it is a very effective tool that can be used to help put an institution further ahead and put an institution in a position where it can say, with hand on heart, we've taken reasonable steps. We're not the FBI or the CIA, but we've taken reasonable steps to start to screen more holistically for this type of risk. This risk, if you're joining from the United States this morning, this risk is on our border. This risk is not far away. This risk is on the border. This risk is interwoven in the economy. It looks like normal companies. It looks like normal people. But many times in media, in blog posts, and other places, we see names of companies, names of individuals linked to, associated with cartel-related activity. And this is something that I think people should be taking very seriously and might not be taking as seriously as they should be.
I think, just to follow up really quick, I think, Stuart, when I do a lot of training throughout the Middle East, and one thing I start the training with, particularly in Saudi Arabia and a couple of what are some people considered high risk, I always start off by telling the truth. And I'm like, the United States is the largest money launderer in the world. Like, it is. Like, it is. And it's not because we have more bad people or anything. The size of our economy is so big that you could move $1 billion, where if you were in Nigeria and it's $1 billion going to be that much more noticeable. So I think we have to take a step back and always be learning from each other, right? And us in the United States need to be learning from everybody around the world, and we need to be sharing and partnering information with everybody. This is why I like FATF, and I like organizations that bring global communities together, because as Stuart pointed out, this is not an American political issue. This is not even a global political issue. I don't think anybody on this call actually cares about politics as much as we care about finding bad illicit actors and ending them. I mean, so we want to end that. And also, if you think about it, like, there's so many people that I work with in Africa or the Middle East that I want them to thrive. I want them to be part of the global economic community. That's how you create global peace. That's how you create economic democracy. So as much as we want to find 1% of the bad people, we want to help the rest and grow our businesses cross-border. because that's how you get peace. That's how you get prosperity. That's how you get partnerships. I always found it interesting that nobody wants to bomb somebody that they're making money with. So it's kind of like it's very interesting. So economics or economic democracy really changes things a great way.
Yeah, that's unfortunately that is all the time we have for questions. So I feel like that's a great place to wrap up, given what you said, John, and also Stuart. It's really important to be protecting against all the threats in the geopolitical world today, including cartels, including network threats, etc. And having holistic screening really is a key. So thank you so much for your time today and for your attendance. We will be sharing the webinar recording to you after the session, so please do keep an eye out for it in your email inbox. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Sigma 360 team. We look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, John and
guys.
Stuart.
Thank you, Bernice.